Hello my quilting friends! My name is Leah Day and welcome to this Frame Quilting Friday video. I've had some questions about tension on a long arm frame, and today I want to run through the steps that I go through whenever I experience tension issues on this machine. Now I have another video on troubleshooting tension issues when the Grace Qnique is set up as a set down, so make sure to check out that video too, so that way you can see how it's a little different when I'm working on the frame versus whenever this machine is set up in a table. Okay. So first thing I do, if I'm doing something weird, like in this case I was free motion couching, go on ahead and take that stuff off of the machine so I know that's no longer an issue. The next thing I'm going to take a look at, tension is thread feeding. That's specifically what it's, kind of what's going on. It is something to do with the top thread, it's something to do with the bobbin thread. So the first thing I do is just visually look at the path running through the top thread. Is it catching on something? If the thread is pulling where you have the bobbin thread coming to the surface of the quilt, then that means your top tension is too high, or something along this line could be pulling and jerking on that thread and causing it to not feed properly. Now I keep my spool of thread on this back left spindle. A lot of people will use the front right, this back right spindle, but I personally have found that that creates a weird twist in my thread. So I like setting my thread on that back left spindle, and then I feed it up into this guide, and then I do something a little different from what it says in the manual. In the manual, you're to wrap it around and go in this way. I wrap it around the opposite way, and I just find that that works my thread a little bit better, and it doesn't get a twist in it. Whenever it goes around the other way, I found my thread was twisting a bit. And then talking about the tension dials here, this top tension dial is really more of a guide. It really controls the thread to make sure that it feeds into this tension disc properly. Now I have found that you can crank down on this so much that the discs are being squeezed together so tightly that they're practically squishing the thread out from the tension discs. So be careful about that, and if you're afraid that maybe you've cranked it down too far, loosen this tension all the way to the lowest setting. This is kind of a reset, and loosen it all the way up until the plastic piece is flush with that silver piece, okay? And then stitch a little bit and adjust maybe a quarter of a turn. You've got a little knob here, you've got a little groove there, quarter of a turn at a time until your machine comes back into good tension. And you want to have the minimum amount of tension that you need in order to have a balance stitched. Because again, if those tension discs are locked together too tightly, then the thread can't pass between them in order to get tension in the first place. So definitely keep that in mind. Another thing that I experienced, I would sometimes forget to thread this little hole, and that is a very important little hole, and I would instantaneously have tension issues. So double checking your threading is really important. This particular guide has a tendency to pop out. That's another one where you really want to just check it, always visually run through the path and make sure everything's okay. Another thing to think about whenever you're experiencing a tension issue is what recently changed. I know this can be a little tricky because sometimes I'll turn off my machine and I won't touch it for a week. And of course I don't remember the last thing that happened. But it's really important to maybe keep a little journal or something in your sewing room near your long arm, so that way you can record. Let's say you changed thread. Let's say you changed bobbins. If you put in a brand new bobbin case, and pop that in right before you left the room, and that might have different tension than what you had before. And changing thread, changing bobbins, quilting over different types of fabric, surprisingly enough, can alter your tension, where, if you're quilting over regular quilting printed cottons, and then you go to a batik, which is a slightly denser weave, you start quilting on silk, you start quilting on jeans or corduroy, all of those different fabrics are going to have different feels to your machine, and they're going to have probably different tension settings. Another thing about the bobbin case, and again, this is a little different from what is in your Grace machine manual. This is just simply my personal advice. I don't like the spring that comes in the bobbin case. I found it fell out once and then I couldn't get it back in where it wasn't catching the thread. Instead, I took it out and I use a Mega Genie Magic Bobbin Washer. This is the big style of washer. And I just pop that in and then wind my bobbin on top just like normal. And I use these on my home machines too, the little genies in my home machines, because it just helps your thread, your bobbin glide and slide more easily. I find I get a little bit better tension. As far as checking the tension, looks like I could probably tighten this up just a bit. What you want to do is, it's almost like a yo-yo. You want it to slowly pull down, and right now it's going pretty speedy. So I could probably adjust that a little bit tighter, but it was working just fine before. I'll probably leave it. So I'm going to clip this off. So that's really my tips for working with the bobbin case. Not a lot changes with the bobbin, and I find that's very rarely the issue with my machine. Most often it's an issue of top thread feeding. It's an issue of the tension disc themselves. Could be your needle, and yes, it's generally a good idea to change your needle. But I want you to be cautious whenever you run into any issue on any style of machine, not to just go at it and change everything at once. You really need to slow down and change one thing and then test, and then change one more thing and test, and keep doing that until you figure out what exactly was going wrong. So here's how I test. This is my tension test. I keep these little tiny pre-cut squares near my long arm. And I always mount the quilt, and I make sure that I have a little bit of extra room on both sides. So that way I can just pop one of these squares down onto the quilt, and I just kind of stick it right on top of that exposed batting. And make sure I've got a little bit of room all around it. Going ahead and pull up my bobbin thread. I'm going to pull that thread through the foot. There we go. And then I just do a little bit of stitching. So here we go. I'm just going to stitch down and around. Little wiggly U-shapes. This is a really good thing because you get the straight line and you get the curve. Both of those things are really good to test. And I got a good bit of stitching out, and then you just simply take a look at those stitches. Take a really close look. They're looking really pretty on the back. It looks like that's almost perfect tension on the back. But I'm not seeing a perfect delineation between those stitches. You know, it's almost like the top thread's almost setting on the surface. That's what it looks like a little bit to me, which means that the bobbin thread is pulling ever so slightly to the surface. So I can loosen my top tension by a 1/4 to 1/2 turn, and then let's do a little bit more stitching. I use these up until I absolutely can't tell the difference between one line of stitching and the next. And then I will grab another square. All right, that's looking better. It really is looking better. And I just flip over and put another one on. Once I think I have the machine set right and I'm pretty happy with it, then I'll stitch out a few more squares just to be sure. Because sometimes, you know, if you've stitched a lot over something you can't quite tell, it can be really hard to see. So here I'll flip this one back, and you can see really nice spacing between the stitches. You see the holes. You don't see little dots of the top thread coming to the back. You also don't see little dots of the back thread coming to the front. Now, I always match my thread color. I always use the exact same color of thread in the bobbin as I'm using on top. And that helps to disguise little tiny tension issues, the itsy bitsy ones. You know, it's just really not worth it to agonize about little tiny dots pulling to one side or the other. If that's the tension issue that's driving you crazy, please just give yourself a break and match thread color. Put the same color thread in the bobbin as the top. You're not going to see that issue anymore, and it's going to stop driving you crazy. And I find that very, very subtle tension fluctuation, you can't really adjust out of it. It's kind of a standard thing on all machines. All machines tend to do that in curves. All machines tend to do that while free motion quilting. And I find most often that comes out in the wash. Once you wash your quilt, those layers of stitching really even out and kind of balance with one another. It's not a problem. So kind of take a step back. If you're feeling super frustrated, number one, that's not the time to be messing with your machine. Take a step back, come at this whenever you're fresh, when you're rested, when you're feeling like taking on the world, right? And then also make sure to only change one thing at a time. So if you think it's your needle, change your needle first. Stitch out a little bit more on some small scrap off the main quilt on the edge, so it doesn't matter if you make a mess over there. You're going to cut it off anyway. Stitch on that small square, see what happens. Your needle didn't fix it? Okay, now it's time to take a look at your top thread and that threading. One other thing that can make a big difference is a thread net, and that is a tool that I use a lot, especially when I use the really big cones of thread. Now, a thread net is basically kind of a plastic sleeve that goes over your thread cone. Make sure whenever you pop it on to have it setting underneath your thread cone a little bit, so it kind of almost the base of the cone is on top of the bottom edge of the thread net. That'll keep it from slipping off. That's a really common problem. A lot of people will put a thread knot on and then the thread net pops right off the second you start your machine. So that's pretty much it. I know it's annoying. I know tension issues are frustrating and you want to tear your hair out. It does get really, really old, but I'll be honest, I very rarely have tension issues on my machine that are not user created, that are not, the thread feeding improperly, or I've just changed threads and not readjusted the machine, or I've just gone to some really weird fabric or done something very strange and not made an adjustment. And I really think it's a good habit to get into. Keep little squares next to your machine. Check in on a daily basis. It takes all of 5 minutes, and it saves you from potentially quilting across your quilt and then having to rip all of that quilting out when you realize the tension wasn't good. So that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed this Frame Quilting Friday, and you'll come and check out more videos posted at leahday.com/frame. And if you have a suggestion for a new long arm quilting tutorial, please let me know in the comments. I am always looking for new suggestions for videos, and this quilt is done. So I'm ready to take it off and try something new. So definitely suggest a new video, and I may just film that for you next week. Until next time, let's go quilt!